now with Glenn so that he can give us his presentation, and I will save our questions for our Q&A at the end of the panel.
Thank you, Olivia, and it's great to be with you this morning in California. Thank you, Charlie, for giving that great overview of the program and the development of the UC Davis Brewing Program and many developments in the industry, certainly driven by many great brewers in California. And yes, the numbers are still up over the 1,000 craft breweries in California. In many ways, it's these craft brewers that have guided some of the research that we've done, that Charlie did, and I'm doing at UC Davis. It's all a partnership we have with the industry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research we're doing currently and looking to the future as well and where things might be going. As Charlie mentioned, we do have these three elements: the teaching, research, and outreach. I will cover the research and specifically the continuing education, because I think there's some great opportunities for partnering with Chile brewers and increasing their knowledge and skills base through some of our programs. So the research we're doing covering basically the raw materials, grains and malt, hops and yeast, and we're doing some what we think is quite novel but very applied research for the industry in looking at upcycling one of our waste streams, particularly the spent grains. That's a large volume waste that brewers have to deal with. And one recurring topic that comes up, and it was first mentioned in the 1800s, they talk about this refreshing power of hops, which we call dry hopping. But there's this sort of sideline that goes with this, which we call hop creep, where there's sort of a continued fermentation happening beyond what the brewer is expecting, with a lower final gravity and an increase in the alcohol content. This is happening more often than most brewers would like, and it becomes a bigger problem in packaged beer if they're actually doing a little bit of dry hopping in packaged beer. And what has become a very recent issue for us, and it sort of ties into something I'm going to talk about with climate change, we're having to deal with wildfires, not just in California now, but across the west coast of the US. And certainly the hop harvest in 2020 suffered from smoke contamination. And we're trying to understand what the effect of that smoke contamination is and how we could possibly mitigate that in the processing. So initially covering the grains and malt quality, certainly we're faced with these strange, they're not so strange, they're becoming more predictable changes in climate. More heat waves, and we're experiencing another heat wave right now in California. The temperature today is going to be 40 degrees Celsius. And I think that's our third week we've had temperatures over 40 degrees. And a significant decrease for California, again, is in another drought, whereas 2 states over to the east, they're in a flood. Arizona's getting some terrible floods at the moment. So there's this greater diversion between climate, heat and drought, and then flooding rains. How does that impact on our processing industries? How does that impact on our grain production, our raw materials, the wildfires with hops? So we're trying to understand not just how it impacts on production. Yes, it can impact on yield. We get heat waves and drought, and impacts on barley yield, wheat yields, so the farmers don't get the income they're looking for, on quality. And more than just protein content and grain size, it impacts on compositional quality. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at some alternative grains, and Charlie mentioned some alternatives, alternative products. We're looking at alternative grains as well, because it's possible that there are other grain types out there that are more suited to some of the climatic regions that experience some extreme events. So we're used to growing barley and wheat. These are not native crops to most of the countries that wheat and barley evolved out of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, but have moved around the world. So they're not what we would consider a true native crop in many countries. There are other native crops that potentially offer some alternatives. So instead of relying completely on barley or wheat or rice, there might be other local native crops that people can start looking to introduce into the system. When we look at these alternatives, how do they impact on flavour? So again, we look at base malt flavours, and we understand that more work with colleagues at Colorado State University looking at the effect of malt aging on flavour. And anecdotally, over years, people have said, I don't want to use malt within a 1 month of production. They like to wait a month before they'll use fresh malt. But they also know that if they buy malt and store it for 6, 9, 12 months, that there is a change in the quality. So we're trying to understand that in a deeper level profile rather than standard malt analysis. My previous work was also looking at starch quality and the impact on gelatinization. So how rapidly and how efficient is the starch enzymes converting starch to sugars. We're seeing this happen. There are problems happening because climate change is changing the starch structure. So it's actually becoming more intense to produce enough fermentable sugars, because sometimes the starch isn't readily gelatinizable at normal mashing temperatures. And the other thing we're looking at here is, my apologies, that image is covering that last point, but more real-time measurement, and not just gravity, but we're wanting to have real-time, so to put technology in the brewer's hands so they can actually have more understanding of sugars and amino acids and bittering compounds real-time in the brew house. So that will empower the brewers to have much more knowledge about what's actually going on in the brewery, and allow them to make decisions about if they need to change the process or shorten some of the steps in a process so they can hit some targets. In terms of the hops, as I mentioned earlier, we're getting into trying to understand more about this hop creep that's associated with dry hopping. We've recently had a student finish who did a very interesting project looking at the yeast side of this potential story. Can yeast mitigate hop creep, or how do different yeasts deal with potential hop creep? And yes, most yeasts still will continue to ferment and provide alcohol and CO2 once hops are introduced in fermentation. Different yeast will deal with it slightly differently, but in the end, they're still producing more alcohol and a lower gravity. So we're sort of saying, well, the yeast really isn't probably a solution. So we're going to move upstream, and we're going to be looking more around understanding composition of the non-fermentable sugars, as well as understanding more about the enzymes coming from the hops. As I mentioned, the smoke taint issue in hops, we're looking to understand how we could possibly drive off some of these smoke phenol compounds and not impact on flavor. So where can we deal with these smoke taint hops in the process if we're forced to use them? Hopefully we've got a test that now we can say, no, these hops are contaminated, so we don't need to use them, or we can't use them. But if brewers are forced to use them, then where can they use them and they won't carry through these phenolic flavors? Also, there's some interesting conversations around the alternative to hops. So we know that when hops were first introduced into brewing in around 900 AD, hops have been used for other things, preservatives and flavoring. But when they were introduced to beer, it certainly had a positive impact. And then a few hundred years later, well, several hundred years later, with the British introducing IPAs, so they knew the power of hops to act as a preservative, but also to sort of increase the alcohol content. So we're looking for alternatives as well. People were using alternatives for bittering, alternative plants for flavoring long before hops were used. So we're exploring those now again as an alternative crop in areas where it can't easily grow hops or can't easily source hops. So more local, more native plants might be suitable. And we're not looking for things like THC and CBD to be added. As a land-grant university, we can't do research on that anyway, and I don't think we need to worry about that. There's much more interesting things we add to beer than that. We're certainly looking at yeasts. There's a collection of yeasts here. There's the FAF collection at UC Davis, and it's got about 1,000 different strains of yeasts, not just Saccharomyces, but also other yeast sources. So we're starting to explore that collection to see if there's some interesting yeasts with novel flavors and aromas that we can bring to the industry, make flavors that we're expecting to come from other raw materials, but in some ways the yeast can produce these flavors themselves. So again, the yeast might be able to bring some novelty to the process where we're relying on other raw materials. And as Charlie mentioned, the no and low alcohol trend, we've probably all been through these cycles where certainly low alcohol, we've seen it before. It's now made another comeback. So we're also looking at, can we actually produce low and possibly no alcohol beers using specific yeasts? So rather than relying on a processing to drive off and distill off the alcohol, maybe we can actually produce it completely naturally and just have a low or possibly even no alcohol relying on a yeast. Jumping into the processing area, we're certainly looking at spent grains. We know that the spent grain material is a significant waste from our brewing process. How do brewers deal with that? Often they're just giving it away to a local farmer who will feed it to some livestock. Sometimes there's no income for the farmer for that, no income for the brewer, and it may even cost the brewer to remove it from the brewery itself. So again, there's a cost that the brewer probably doesn't really want to have to deal with. So we're looking at options for upcycling. Can we actually turn that waste stream into a valuable product? There's some interesting stuff done previously. They're looking at composting and how they can actually just apply it across the farm and use it as almost like a fertilizer. There's a number of food products now available where people are actually literally taking the spent grain and turning it into cookies or breads, quite interesting foods. We know that the fibrous component of the spent grain can actually be used as an alternative to cardboard. So they're looking at ways they can upcycle, and actually you might be able to produce some of your cardboard packaging from your spent grain material. So you're having to buy less cardboard into the system. The specific area we're looking at is energy. How do we actually use this as a potential source of energy? There's lots of cellulosic material left over, lots of protein left over. How can we actually potential the spent grain into some sort of energy source that can be utilized in the brewery? The next thing we're looking at, again, I'll carry going on more about this dry hopping process where brewers are actually adding hops at some point in fermentation, and we know it's valuable in adding hop flavor and aroma. But the downside to this is we see this hop creep and the possible impact of hop creep in terms of higher alcohol contents, more CO2 being produced, impacts on those sorts of parameters. How do we mitigate? Well, at the moment, we have a pretty good understanding of the role that hops have. We know that the diastatic power enzymes coming from hops can certainly continue to break down the non-fermentable sugars into fermentable sugars during fermentation, and therefore the yeast will continue the fermentation. We really don't understand that non-fermentable sugar profile, so we're looking to use more real-time technology to measure these non-fermentable sugar profile and maybe consider that before we dry hop. If there's potentially too much non-fermentable sugar, is there a risk that we could have more hop creep? Of course, timing of hop addition is important. And as I said, measuring more real-time data. So understanding the fermentable sugars in fermentation, pre and post dry hopping, might help brewers understand how they can control this more. We're certainly getting into understanding the composition more, and people would be familiar with some of these new omics technologies, and metabolomics is being used more. We're looking at to understand the non-volatile profiles of worts and beer and the different products we're making, and certainly using proteomics, where we go from measuring a single protein content, total protein content in beer, to literally measuring the thousands of individual proteins, how the processing affects these, what happens during malting, what happens during brewing, and really, is there any other proteins of importance that we're really yet to understand or yet to actually consider, but now they might be actually more important than we've ever known. Quickly moving into the continuing professional education, certainly Charlie touched on that early. And we have a range of courses from very basic, introduction to practical brewing through to the Master Brewer Certificate program. And I'll make special mention about the Master Brewer Certificate because it's actually aligned to the industry. A lot of the students have come from a different background. They've had different careers and they're suddenly saying, no, I want to get into this industry. There's just so much interest. So they're actually transitioning from one career into a new career and wanting to get into brewing in a serious way. We actually have people coming from breweries that are wanting to upskill, improve their knowledge and improve their understanding of the process. So we get people from all walks of life coming to do the Master Brewers program. In general, they're all focused on getting a job in the industry. That's what they're focused on, or possibly even starting their own brewery. And we have a student from last year's program who's actually just started his brewery down near San Francisco. The news is that the 2022 program will become an online program. So instead of people having to come to Davis for 15 weeks, there is an alternative. So there will be a new online version of the Master Brewers program. It's in modules and it's over a specific 2-year timeline. Once you've done those 7 modules, then you can come to the campus and do the 2-week boot camp, which is a very intense 2 weeks. But we are keeping the 15-week program open. So there will still be another 15-week in-person program here in Davis next year. So we'll actually be running these 2 streams. We'll continue the in-person, but we'll certainly have this new online program. And as Charlie mentioned, there's a long history here. We've got a great track record. We cover the theory and practical components. We've got global expertise as instructors. So it's not just an academic exercise. We bring in some of the best in the world to give instruction. And certainly the pandemic, one of the upsides, if there are any upsides, one of the upside has been this virtual presentation. So we can actually have people from the UK, from New York, giving presentations to the students. So it sort of puts us more in touch out there with the global areas of expertise. And as Charlie said, sort of from that very early pilot brewery through to our current modern system here. So that image there is the pilot brewery. We've got 6 fermenters that take 1 batch. So 1 batch off the brew house into 1 fermenter, or we can split it into smaller fermenters that allows us to do much more detailed experimental work using replicated fermentations. And as I said, it's basically because we've got such a close connection with industry, and it's really the industry that kick-started this program way back in 1958. It was the industry saying we need something, and we've continued to listen to the industry. We listen to what they're looking for. We're offering suggestions, we offer them training, and we can also do research. And the other great thing, and Charlie mentioned one of our positions with the Sierra Nevada and Dad Brewer, we have another brewer. So we actually have 2 full-time brewers that allows us to actually, and these are experienced brewers, have come to the program, and allows us to sort of stay up to date with what's happening in the brewing industry. It's not just some academic exercise where we start to lose touch with reality. As I mentioned, the new CPE course, and I will move on, I'm taking way too much time. So there's the link to the brewing program. The new course is up next year. We are looking to tailor some other brewing courses in cellaring, packaging, and advanced brewing. And we are considering a distillation course in summer 2022. And as Charlie said, certainly going online has allowed us to deliver more webinars and online courses. So the link there can get you to the CPE website for brewing. And there might be something there that would be really important for you to take the next step in your career. A little bit of crystal ball gazing, where we see things happening. Well, certainly sustainability is an issue. How does the industry maintain sustainability and become more sustainable? And there's some areas that certainly the industry is looking at, and we're looking at some of those as well. Charlie mentioned some interesting beers, and I'm a bit like Charlie. I'm not a big fan of sour beers and possibly even some hazy beers, but we don't think hazy is a trend anymore. It's hazy is here to stay. And there's also interesting stuff happening in hybrid beers, and we get some beer wine hybrids now, which is a really interesting combination. I can probably see Charlie's eyes rolling right now. And the other thing, the brewers are looking for more data. So they've got much more control of the process. So I think we're over to Q&A session, and this is just an image of my 4 students. One of the big things we're passionate about is diversity in our industry, and we have programs on ensuring diversity in the industry. And this was the first time myself and my 4 students had a chance to sit down and have a beer together when the pandemic started. And this was back in May. So it took 14 months before we could all get together and have a beer together. So that's it for me. Sorry, I took way too much time. Over to you, Mauricio and Olivia.